Every crime requires a guilty act. We don't just punish people just for guilty thoughts alone. For a crime to be committed, there has to be some action or some conduct, and that's probably a good thing. If we were to punish people just for guilty thoughts alone, then we'd all be in trouble. Because who hasn't at least thought about doing something wrong? But the important thing is that we don't act upon those guilty thoughts. So criminal law tries to punish and prevent guilty actions, not just guilty thoughts. So in criminal law, we refer to this requirement of an action as the Actus Reus. The Actus Reus. Actus Reus is just Latin for guilty act. All right, so what constitutes the Actus Reus? How do we establish this element? That sort of depends. It depends on the kind of crime that we're talking about. And there are two types of crimes. There are conduct crimes and result crimes. A conduct crime is just a crime where you can satisfy the act requirement, the Actus Reus, just by showing the conduct itself. Okay, so take, for example, perjury, lying while under oath. Now, it doesn't matter whether anybody believes your lies. And it doesn't matter whether your lies have any effect on the outcome of the case or the hearing or whatever. Just the act of lying while under oath satisfies the Actus Reus element of the crime of perjury. Another example of this is possession. Say possession of a firearm. It doesn't matter whether anybody gets hurt by that gun or whether you even use that gun. Just possessing the gun is enough to satisfy the Actus Reus, the action that's required to satisfy the crime of possession. And one more example, driving under the influence. Whether or not you hurt anybody, simply driving a car while intoxicated satisfies the Actus Reus, the action requirement of the crime of DUI. All right, so for these conduct crimes, the Actus Reus is established just by showing the conduct itself. The conduct itself is enough to establish the Actus Reus of the crime. Now, it's a little bit different for result crimes. Result crimes require more than just the conduct. We have to show, in addition to the conduct, a particular result. Take, for example, assault. Now, it's generally not illegal to swing a baseball bat around. But if you swing a baseball bat in a way that hurts somebody, or that at least reasonably makes the person afraid that he's going to be hurt, then you might be guilty of an assault. And that's because in addition to the conduct of swinging the baseball bat, which by itself is not illegal, we've also shown the result of a person being hurt or being reasonably afraid of being hurt. Right? Another example of a result crime is murder. Okay, we have to show not just some action, but also that there was a particular result, that a person died. Right? And one more example. Fraud. Okay, fraud is a result crime. You might try to trick somebody, but if that person wasn't actually defrauded, then you haven't committed fraud. For example, let's say that you find a ring on the ground and it appears to be just like a cheap toy ring. And so you polish it up and you sell it to somebody at a really high price and you tell the person that this is a real ring. Now, you are trying to defraud that person. But if it turns out that that ring is a real ring, and so the person is getting, actually a good ring, paid a reasonable price for a good ring, well, then the person wasn't defrauded because the result wasn't there. The person actually was not defrauded. You might have tried to defraud the person, but there was no fraud. All right, so for a result crime, we have to show more than just the conduct to establish Actus Reus. Actus Reus for a result crime is established by showing the conduct and a particular result. Now, conduct is required for both of these. Okay, it's just that for result crimes we have to also show a particular result. But this conduct, it can't just be any old conduct. To satisfy Actus Reus, the conduct must be voluntary and conscious. Voluntary and conscious. Now, this makes sense if you think about it. If we're trying to punish certain acts, it's not really fair to punish an act if the person has no control over it, right? If it's involuntary. And then also, as a deterrence, it's not going to be very effective either, because again, the person has no control over what he does. And so if an act is not voluntary and conscious, then it can't satisfy the Actus Reus element of the crime. Now, when we say that something is voluntary, an action is voluntary, we mean that it's of a person's own volition. So let's say that there's a person who's at home and he's drunk, All right, and for some reason the police come over and they arrest him for something else, and they handcuff him and take him outside. Well, he can't be convicted of public intoxication, even though he's drunk, and even though he's in public, because his act of going outside, right, the act of going into public, was not of his own volition. The only reason he went outside is because the police made him go outside. So it wasn't a voluntary action. And then for something to be voluntary, it has to be something that's not reflexive or convulsive. Right? It has to be a voluntary bodily movement. So take, for example, an epileptic seizure. If you're driving and you suddenly experience a seizure, and so you lose control of the car and steer it into a person and hurt a person, well, you're not going to be convicted of a crime for that. And that's because your actions, the actus reus of the crime, was not voluntary. Right? You couldn't control yourself. You were having the seizure. Now, there is a caveat to this. Right? This is assuming that you didn't know of the risk. If you know that you have epilepsy and that you have seizures on a regular basis, and you still get into a car and drive around, well, then you might be criminally liable. But otherwise, if your action was not voluntary, then that action cannot satisfy the actus reus element of the crime. Now, when we say that the action must also be conscious, we just mean that you have to be awake, right, not asleep. So if you do some bad things while you're sleepwalking and you don't know that you're doing it, well, then those actions would not be sufficient to establish the crime, right, to satisfy the elements of the crime, because the actus reus element would not have been a conscious act. And the same is actually true for intoxication. If you're intoxicated to the point that you don't know what you're doing, then your actions cannot satisfy the actus reus element of the crime. Now, there's a big caveat to this, of course. Okay, it has to be if you're not intoxicated, if it's involuntary intoxication. Right? This only works if the intoxication was involuntary. You can't just drink a lot and then say, I didn't know what I was doing, and therefore I didn't satisfy the act element because I was unconscious. Okay, that doesn't work. It's only if the intoxication was involuntary. All right, now sometimes the action is actually the absence of an action. So we can actually satisfy the actus reus element of a crime by showing an omission as well, the failure to act. Now, in general, we don't have a duty to act. There's no legal duty to act, generally speaking. But if there is a legal duty to act that is imposed by, say, a statute, okay, then, well, if the statute says you have to do something and you don't do it, then you have failed to do an action that you are legally required to do. And that failure to act can satisfy the actus reus element of the crime. Another example of this would be a legal duty that's created by a special relationship. You know, in general, you don't have to feed people. But if you have a certain special relationship with a person, say that person is your child, then you do have a legal duty to feed that child, right? And your failure to feed that child could be the act that satisfies the actus reus of the crime, right? In addition to a special relationship, a legal duty might be imposed by, say, a contract, okay? Or maybe if you caused the danger. If you cause a danger, then you have a legal duty to try to fix that danger and make it more safe. And if you don't do that, then your failure to do so is the action that constitutes the actus reus. Okay, there could be other reasons as well. But I just wanted to point out that sometimes the failure to act, the omission of an act, can actually be the quote-unquote act that satisfies actus reus. All right, so let's review. For every crime, there must be a guilty act, the actus reus. All right? And the actus reus is satisfied by showing the conduct for a conduct crime. Right? So for a conduct crime, we establish actus reus by just showing the conduct itself. But for a result crime, we need to show the conduct and a particular result. In either event, the conduct needs to be voluntary and conscious. And sometimes the act can be an omission. So it can be an act or an omission if there's a legal duty to act.